Good evening. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Thursday Night Live with Aish New York and Aish TV. My name is Rabbi Elliot Matthias. I'm the executive director of Aish New York. This is our weekly show where we deal with all kinds of different current issues, relate them to Judaism. And certainly, I think we've shown over the last couple months, we have not shied away from hot topics, from controversial topics. And tonight is going to be no different. We're going to talk tonight a little bit about what we've been seeing really across the country over the last month or so, when there's been protests across the country. And one of the rallying points, one of the rallying cries around some of the protests has been the sort of the challenging of the status quo of certain symbols that have stood for a long time in this country. Statues, flags. We're even seeing now sports teams, names of sports teams, things that we've sort of taken for granted but have been challenged at times, maybe because of things they represent, their symbolism, things that offend people, things that certainly that are racist, that are targeting certain minorities. And there's been a call to take these things down. We've seen statues literally pulled down, destroyed. And so we're going to talk tonight about this issue. You know, it reminded me, and if you saw the promo that we put out for this issue, comparing the idea of toppling the different statues that are happening recently with the age-old, thousands of years old story about the original monotheist, the original patriarch of the Jewish people, Abraham. And Abraham, in so many ways, he represented the idea of standing against the status quo, of believing in something so much that he was able to stand up against the world, and he was able to put into action the things that he stood against. So one of the famous stories, it's actually not in the Torah, in the Bible itself, but it's one of the stories of the Medrash, of the explanations of the deeper stories around the Torah. Is a famous story that when Abraham was a child, the story goes that not only were his parents idol worshipers, but they actually owned the corner idol store. They made a good buck, right, selling idols to their fellow townspeople. And Abraham, as a young child, came to understand that these idols didn't really have power. And he came to understand that there had to be one power in the world, this idea of monotheism that he eventually spread so far and wide in the world. And the story goes that one night, when his parents' idol store was closed, he went in the middle of the night and he smashed all of the idols, these idols that stood against his basic beliefs in one God, in one power, that everything has one source. He smashed all of these idols, except for the largest idol. The largest idol he let stay intact, and he took the axe that he had used to destroy all the idols, and he put it in the hands of this large idol. In the morning, when his parents came in and they walked into the store, and the idols are destroyed everywhere. What happened? They couldn't believe it. They scream, right, to little Abraham, what happened here? And Abraham says, what do you mean? You know, you see, the axe is in the hands of that big idol. He must have done it. And of course, his parents look at little Abraham and say, what are you, crazy? Right? It's just stone, right? It's not real. Of course, they couldn't have done this to the other idols. And Abraham had proven his point, right? That these idols were not worth giving power to, were not worth bowing down to. But yet there was something else that was in control. But we see this idea from Abraham. We learn from the very beginning that there are certain things that we believe in so much that we're willing to stand up for. We're even willing to destroy things for it to a certain degree. That's what Abraham taught us. And even when it goes against the grain of what our community is telling us, what our world is telling us, when we believe there's an injustice, we have to stand up for it. I want to welcome to the show now my colleague, Rabbi Adam Jacobs. He and I are going to lead this discussion tonight. And thank you, Rabbi Adam, for joining with me. And I'll hand it over to you to introduce our really special guest.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Elliot. How's everything going tonight? Oh, you're gone. You can't answer. Okay. Well, I had the pleasure and privilege of actually attending Brandeis University back in the 90s, where I made the mistake, in retrospect, of not having availed myself of any history classes and very few Judaic studies classes. And so I did not have the opportunity to learn from Professor Sarna, who I'm going to introduce presently, but he is one of the world's leading experts in American Jewish history. He is the Braun Professor of American Jewish History and the director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at my alma mater, Brandeis University. He's also past president of the Association for Jewish Studies and the chief historian at the National Museum of American Jewish History in Pennsylvania. Dubbed by Forward newspaper in 2004 as one of America's 50 most influential American Jews, he was chief historian for the 350th commemoration of the American Jewish community and is recognized as a leading commentator on American Jewish history, religion, and life. In 2009, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And in addition to that, he holds 4 honorary degrees. There's much more to say about him. He's published many books and is a fascinating individual. It gives me great pleasure now to introduce Dr. Jonathan Sarna.
Hi. Nice
How are you, Doctor?
Thank God. Nice to be with you.
Thank you for joining us. We are looking forward to your insight and having a fascinating discussion on this important topic. And we figured we would open up with the following question. The concept of statues as idols. So a lot of people, on Facebook, there was a bunch of comments that people made, and they saw our ad, that we seem to be comparing Abraham and what's happening in modern times, and they cried foul. Wait a second, these statues are not necessarily idols. So the question we have for you is, how have Jews seen statues historically? And is the ban against them in Jewish thought absolute?
So, in a sense, we are recreating an old debate in Judaism between one group that disputed in the Ten Commandments said Jews are opposed to any graven image. And that tradition, particularly strong in the Ashkenazi world among Jews from the German lands, they didn't want to have anything to do with any kind of monuments and statues and so on. To their mind, what made Judaism great was the idea that it was totally spiritual. Other Jews, the Sephardic tradition, and others said, no. The Bible is only referring to idols. If it's not an idol, then this doesn't apply. And we know that tradition is live. You go to places in the Caribbean like Curacao, you can see even in a cemetery, a Jewish cemetery, iconography, and occasionally statues and so on. So this debate between those who are against any icons, and iconism is the fancy word, and those who simply are anti-idolatrous, goes back and forth in the 19th century. Ashkenazi Jews are particularly fierce on being opposed to all graven images, largely because the great philosopher Immanuel Kant praised Jews for being very strict on this matter. He was a Protestant. He did not believe in Catholic icons and images. He thought Jews had the right idea. Jews were thrilled that such a great philosopher praised them. And many of the German rabbis and German Jewish rabbis and thinkers argued that, that's what makes Judaism different. We're opposed to any kinds of icons. After we see the world change and statues of various kinds become normative, by the 20th century, you see even in Orthodox circles that statues in honor of people that have no relation to idolatry at all become acceptable. So it's an interesting example of a long debate in Jewish life on this matter. And there are even rabbinic sources that you can quote on both sides of the issue.
Right. So my understanding, at least theologically speaking, is that the Jewish opposition to idolatry is focused on the belief that pagans had that these idols could be interfaced with, that it was a quid pro quo. If I worship you, you're going to give me rain, you're going to give me the crops that I need. And ultimately, therefore, it became a self-serving endeavor where it's not so much trying to establish a relationship with, with an all-powerful being who has an unshakable vision and morality, but that I could manipulate the forces of nature in order to serve myself. And therefore, idolatry, polytheism, is about me. And therefore, the great distinction that monotheism brought to the world was that you're dealing with a deity that can't be negotiated with. He's going to do the right thing whether you prefer it or don't. And that was a radical departure from everything that had come previously. Would you say that that is an accurate depiction?
I think that's right. And I think that it's a very hard idea. Maimonides, of course, knows how hard it is. And there are all sorts, even of monotheistic faiths, that have trouble with that idea and try and put a face on the deity. And of course, Jews living in Eastern Europe knew this very well, because they knew that in the Russian Orthodox tradition, the churches were full of icons. And as you say, people thought those icons protected them, even though that church insisted it was monotheistic. Jews stood far apart from that idea. I think that the notion of a statue which had no power at all, but is simply in honor of somebody outside the realm of religion, is actually fairly modern. And most of those statues are in the last few hundred years. And that represents a change in the world, even artistically.
That's really interesting. So, we're sort of fast forwarding to more of the modern times, and this idea of statues in general. I mean, I guess a few hundred years to some people that might seem like ancient times, but for Jews, that's modern.
Yeah.
That's modern.
A minute, yeah.
But I'm interested to really, to jump into, let's say, I don't want to say the controversial stuff, but to get into now what's going on today. And we're seeing, this isn't completely new, but for certain, we saw at the fall of the Soviet Union and the tearing down of, the Stalin and Lenin, those types of statues. But we're seeing it now over this last few weeks here in America, statues from Confederate leaders to former presidents, that people are calling or actually going and smashing and pulling these statues down. Does this in any way as I think a lot of people are tuning in tonight, how should we react as Jews? But I'm wondering from your perspective, is there anything in American Jewish history, Jewish history in general, that sort of can inform us on this issue? Have there been other, historic episodes that would relate to what's going on today that you would pull from?
I mean, certainly the Maccabees pulled down statues when that's part of their purifying of the temple. Of course, from a Jewish perspective, those statues were polluting the temple. And even in America, there was one Jew involved in it. In the time of the American Revolution, part of the revolution was pulling down statues of the king. Yeah, you walk around America, you don't see any statues to British monarchs. Once there were. After the revolution, they got pulled down. That's a very old tradition. We all watched it on television when Saddam Hussein was overthrown. They pulled down his statues. It's a very old tradition. Interestingly, there was a big debate in Jewish circles about building a statue, and that involved a very philanthropic, well-known Jew named Judah Touro of New Orleans. New Orleans was full of statues to various people, say Henry Clay, since Judah Touro had been very active there and also left a will, the most charitable will ever to that time written in America. He left the equivalent of millions of dollars to charities, both general and Jewish. So the idea was, let's make him a role model and build a statue. And the interesting thing is the Jewish community divided on that matter. They also wrote back to Europe for opinions. Of course, since the Civil War started in the meanwhile, the whole question became moot, and New Orleans had bigger problems than whether or not to build a statue to Judah Touro. And, only a historian remembers that debate, but it's interesting that Jews debated it. It is also the case that actually a Jew was responsible for bringing a statue of Thomas Jefferson. The great statue of Thomas Jefferson in Washington was paid for by a Jew named Uriah Phillips Levy, who felt that Jefferson, as somebody who was deeply significant in religious liberty and a proponent of that, had helped Jews, and he pays for that statue, and there are other Jefferson statues. And finally, in America, we do see statues that are actually, the artist, the sculptor, is a Jew. Quite a few of them. There was a very significant Jewish sculptor by the name of Moses Ezekiel. He was eventually knighted, so he's known as Sir Moses Ezekiel. He was born in Virginia. He did a lot of his work in Rome, but he creates a whole range of statues, many of them famous Confederate statues, because, as I said, he was a Virginian. He fought in the Confederacy. He trained at VMI, and he does statues of Jefferson Davis and Stonewall Jackson. A Virginia mourning its dead is his statue, and others. So there are Jewish involvements in the question of statues. That said.
Okay.
I don't know what that was.
All right, I mean, probably shows I've been talking too long. Yeah,
It's keeping us on our toes.
All right, and there it is. Yeah,
Believe me, Professor, could have been a lot worse.
I was just going to simply say that all of that said, we should remember, for those listening in, that there is, of course, a horrific statue, the Arch of Titus, that depicts Jews in a very, very a negative way. They're being led. It's a statue in Rome that recalls the capture of Jerusalem. And although there was a very strong Jewish tradition not to walk under the Arch of Titus. I am not familiar with anybody who said we should pull it down or blow it up. I think there was a sense. It's historic. It's disparaging. We won't honor it, but we don't meddle in history. Obviously, as a historian, I have some sympathy with that. And of course, in the same way, anybody can go in Israel and you see all sorts of statues. Some of them were pulled down, some of them fell down to Jupiter, to Titus, to Tiberius. Even occasionally you find one to Nebuchadnezzar, and they're all in the museum. In other words, we don't have them up in the middle of King George Street, but they're not totally destroyed. They're contextualized as a reminder of Palestine's past, so to speak, of who ruled it after the temple was destroyed, and in a museum. And sometimes that's the middle ground. We shift what other people revere to a museum where they can be described and contextualized.
You know, it's so interesting, you know, and listening to you. I mean, obviously the Jewish connection is fascinating, but you know, the first example you gave, which just struck me that I hadn't thought about, you know, that we don't see, you know, images today from, you know, England and from the king, you know, those were taken down. On the other hand, you just mentioned like the Arch of Titus, and there's certain things that maybe do offend us, but we're not calling to pull them down. Maybe I just want to ask Rabbi Jacobs actually for a second, just your thoughts. I mean, how do you balance those two things in your mind when you see what's going on today with the pulling down of these statues and just what Professor Sarna just said, these two sort of, I don't know if it's the extremes, but when we'd probably all agree it was right to do it, and then another example where we'd probably say don't do it. How do you find the balance of what's happening today?
It's a great question, and I think honestly, in considering having this presentation, I think I personally struggled with an obvious Judaically historical desire to knock down certain statues. At least, I mean, you just told the Abraham story, and he's a hero for that. And we heard about the Maccabees who pulled down statues from our temple, which, you know, so on the one hand, we celebrate those with pride. You know, on the other hand, I'm thinking about, you know, a number of years ago, the Taliban blew up a bunch of Buddhist statues, and there was an international outcry. You know, how could they so maliciously knock down other people's culture? So, you know, I'm going to be honest and say that, you know, as a rabbi, it's difficult. I don't know exactly what the answer is. I do know that you know, the issue boils down to there are images that people find deeply offensive, that they represent something that is intolerable to them, and that I can relate to, you know. And I think that question can be really spun out very broadly. The question of Confederate flags, the question of, can you speak in a way that in the presence of somebody who doesn't want to hear what you have to say? How far do we take this? Is intolerance of somebody else's position based on your morality totally fine? Or are there limits? And I do like the fact personally that we do not call for the destruction of the Arch of Titus. And I'll just mention one other thing, which is when Notre Dame burnt down. Was it last year even? That was the first time I discovered that there was blatantly anti-Semitic imagery built into Notre Dame. And however, I still felt bad about it as a historical building. You know, I didn't want it to see it destroyed, and I wouldn't have minded, you know, if it had continued with this anti-Semitic image on it, because I want to learn from history. And I guess that's something I would bounce back to the professor. And, you know, do you feel that people are making a mistake nowadays? If we pull down all the Confederate statues, will we fail to learn from history?
You know, I think that the question calls for discernment It's fascinating. The Hebrew word da'at often doesn't mean knowledge. It means the ability to make fine distinctions between holy and secular, between different things. So there are really multiple kinds of statues, and maybe we need to keep them separate. Yes, there were statues that were put up in the late 19th century, early 20th, simply in order to intimidate the African American community. Many of them are not very important statues, and those clearly are in a very different category than historic statues like the Arch of Titus or the Lincoln Memorial, or for that matter, Jefferson, where you can learn a lot from them. And your point about the churches, you would have to take down half the churches in Europe. They have images of what's called ecclesia and synagoga. You have the church and the synagogue that is kneeling to the church, that has been superseded by the church. These are deeply disturbing images. There are many of them. They were very popular in the Middle Ages. Today, anyone who studies Jewish-Christian relations studies those images. But I think Christians, in many cases, have gone beyond those images, even though they remain as a reminder of an unhappy past. And the question is, which statues should be brought down simply because they were vehicles for intimidation, and which ones might be remembered for recalling unhappy episodes in American history, or we're talking about Jewish history from the past that people should know, that should be contextualized, but that we don't call for them to be brought down. And to my mind, that's what requires discernment. I worry a little bit when these decisions are made by the mob rather than after careful thought.
Right. You see, it's so interesting, a statue, let's say, of Robert E. Lee, who obviously has other historical context, but is seen as the one who fought for the Confederacy, is in some ways, is the symbol of that movement. But you're seeing calls for, you mentioned, as a Jew who helped bring the statue of Thomas Jefferson. There's calls today to take down statues of Thomas Jefferson, of George Washington. And I think your idea of discernment, I look at it somewhat as context as well. In Judaism, I feel strongly, and I think this is a power of Judaism, is that we don't believe any human being, right, is a deity. No human being is perfect. Moses made mistakes. He got angry. He hit the rock. He didn't believe in God fully in a certain point, right? King David, right? What he's accused of is some people would be in jail for the things he was accused of doing, right? But yet we see these as our leaders, because yes, they made mistakes. They had parts of them that certainly were lacking, but in the totality, in the context, they were great people. And I worry that, I don't know if there is a statue of, George Wallace, the clearly racist, governor of Alabama. I mean, think certain people represent something that, I think there's a pretty clear majority of people find to be reprehensible. And maybe those need, for the sake of society, that we need to take them down to move forward. But when we start going to that next level of people who, that's not what they don't, yes, Thomas Jefferson had slaves, and we can condemn that. We can say that wasn't right, but that's not what he represents. It seems to me that discernment seems to be, at least in some circles, really lacking.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the appropriate response is, what blind spots do we have? That's why I think the biblical figures are truly human and do mistaken, maybe even wicked things, because that's how we relate to them. Oh, he gave into weaknesses. Maybe I can still be in other ways like King David. And I think it's amazing that a brilliant man like Jefferson nevertheless had this terrible blind spot, or bringing it forward, Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson is fascinating because he had tremendous respect for Jews and yet had a tremendous blind spot when it came to African Americans. He appoints the first Jew to the Supreme Court. That's Louis Brandeis. I have to mention him once in every hour. He appoints other Jews, and he supports the Balfour Declaration. From a Jewish perspective, Woodrow Wilson was a hero, and nevertheless, he had this terrible blind spot. So either you say, let's pull down everything that has to do with Wilson, or you say, let's note that here was a man who did many, many good things for America, for Jews, for the world, and yet he had a terrible blind spot. I wonder what blind spots we have, I have, that others one day will notice. That to me may be a more productive way of thinking about some of these issues. That said, like you, some of the Confederate generals for whom there are statues, honestly, to my mind, they're close to terrorists. And all they are known for is battling to preserve slavery. I don't feel the same way about them as I do about Jefferson or Washington and so forth.
Well, there's another leader, not on the Confederate side, on the Union side, who I know you know a lot. You wrote a book about Ulysses S. Grant.
Right.
And it was interesting because there has been calls even today about taking down his statues. I believe, I don't know the full story. I think he owned a slave, but he freed him, so I don't know exactly where he was on that issue, but you write about his relationship with the Jews. I know he's part of this debate right now as well. How do you see him fitting in?
Well, and of course I'm involved in this, but Ulysses S. Grant is, on the one hand, responsible for the most anti-Semitic official act in all of American history. He expels Jews from his war zone in December of 1862. His war zone is a large area. Now, fortunately for Jews, Abraham Lincoln reversed that order as soon as he heard of it. There was a Jew in Paducah, Kentucky, who went down to Washington carrying the order, and Lincoln knew nothing about it. And it's fascinating, he instantly reversed it. But still, many Jews remember that and wonder, how do we honor Grant? However, as I did indeed show in the book, Grant later repents, and as president, he appoints Jews and as a Jewish advisor, and we also have an autobiography by his wife who said that Grant felt that later that Abraham Lincoln was absolutely right and that he should never had made an order against a whole group of people just because a few Jews were caught smuggling. So do we say Grant was, in Jewish words, a Baal Tshuva? He was a penitent. The Jews forgave him. When he died, Jews mourned in synagogues and widely was mourned. Later on, the later part of Grant was forgotten. All we remembered was the sinful part. But personally, I think the real lesson of Grant is that human beings can learn and do better and repent, and you do something wrong and later you make up for it and feel guilty. That to me is a great human lesson. It's the lesson, if you will, of Yom Kippur. But certainly there are people who felt, listen, it was an unforgivable act to expel the Jews. How do we celebrate somebody who did such a thing?
I wanted to ask you, you had mentioned when we spoke earlier that there was a unique Jewish connection to the Confederate flag specifically. Would you be able to tell us that story? You know, obviously a lot of
Sure. It's almost unknown, and it's a relevant story. When there were significant Jews in South Carolina, which of course is the first state to secede from the Union, and they secede, they need a flag. And the original flag has crosses in the place where today there are so-called bars. They were Christian crosses, and Mr. Moiza, who was a Jew, pointed out that would be offensive to Jews, and there were significant Jews in the South, and the design was actually changed to the Confederate flag that we know today, the stars and bars, in a sense because the people in South Carolina listened to the sensitivities of Jews. Now, one might learn from that, they were sensitive to Jews. Let's be sensitive to African Americans today who look at that flag and what they see is a lynch mob, slavery, and hundreds of years of oppression. So, but it is interesting that the very Confederate flag reflects a certain sensitivity to the Jewish community, and the design was changed in order to address the Jewish community's complaints and to make sure that they felt that they were insiders in the Confederacy rather than outsiders. More Jews are in the Union, I hasten to point out, than in the Confederacy, but you had 25, 30,000 Jews, and some of them were very, very significant, and their sensitivities were taken into account.
That's so interesting, pointing out that I think Jews were really on both sides of at that time of the Civil War, and obviously with certain shared beliefs. I mean, this whole thing is fascinating to me. That, I mean, you take the Confederate flag, right? So I think that the original idea of the flag was it was a representation of succession, of succeeding from the Union. And today you would certainly have certain people in the South who would say it represents, the Southern culture and Southern, sophistication and the Southern, nobility and heritage. And then, like you said, others see it as a symbol of white supremacism, white nationalism, of slavery. I'm curious how you, as a historian, I mean, I assume as a historian, you look at the facts. What happened? How do you balance that with different narratives of how people look at symbols?
Well,
it just sparked it in my mind because as a Jewish people, I guess at that time, maybe not today, we were on different sides of this. I'm just curious, how do you see it as a black and white issue? This is a racist symbol. Get rid of it.
no, I think we Jews should especially at least understand. First of all, it's very common that symbols mean different things to different people. Take the most obvious example. If you're a Catholic and you walk into a church and you see a cross and maybe you see a nativity scene, that to you reflects the highest religious values. But when a Jew sees the same symbol, the cross is a reminder of oppression. The nativity scene is a reminder of oppression. Jews don't look at those Christian symbols and view them with sanctity and awe. They often look at them in a very negative way. And I think there are many symbols like that. Honestly, even the yarmulke, there's a kind of interesting a question asked to Moshe Feinstein about wearing a yarmulke, because even though to religious Jews, wearing a skull cap covering the head is a sign of sanctity, of maybe what makes Jews distinctive, a sign of awe before God. To other people, it's a sign that you're different from everybody else, that you're a religious fanatic, that you're not open-minded. And of course, knowing that the same symbol means different things to different people, the question was, when I'm working in my secular office, do I have to wear a yarmulke or not? That the question is what's so interesting, because it's again a reminder that symbols mean different things to different people. There's a whole branch of study called semiotics that talks about how symbols are viewed, and that's clearly the case, to bring us all the way back to the Confederate flag, where to Southerners it may mean one thing, to blacks another. I have to say, and we should always remember it, the swastika. There are people who say, oh, but the swastika reminds us of our noble German past and to when Germany had an empire.
Or even,
and obviously, when a Jew sees the swastika,
right,
we see something very, very different.
right.
So that's what's really going on. I think it's very common that symbols mean different things to different.
I think about it. I'm a big sports fan, so the other area where this sort of, I don't call it a battle, but this conflict is happening in our society. You have the statues, you have the flag, and you have sports teams now, right? This is a big thing with the Native Americans, and sometimes I think about, sometimes it's much easier to be objective when you don't take it personally, right? When it's not about you. So sometimes when I hear these issues, I try to think, okay, if they were talking about the Jews, would I think about it differently? So the Washington Redskins, okay? I mean, I don't know how much you know about the name. My understanding, it was a derogatory name, that it was used in a derogatory way for Native Americans. And okay, maybe today in the more mainstream American culture, people don't see it that way, but many Native Americans do see it as derogatory. And if it was the Washington D.C. Kikes, we'd be looking at this very, very differently than, or you have a team called the Cleveland Indians. So Indians isn't derogatory per se, but if they were called the Cleveland Jews, that was the name of a professional sports team, I think the Jewish community would not be so happy about that. We'd be wondering, why is there a team called the Jews? So it's interesting sometimes. Not, and then you have teams called the Braves, or the Blackhawks, which are not. They say they're actually honoring the Native American history through some of those names as well. So it is interesting, again, how to see. You mentioned distinction before, I think was the key word. Seeing the shades of gray of context and things. But I do sometimes think about, as Jews, if we put, like I said, if we put ourselves, and we talked about the Arch of Titus before, but I read recently, I forget where, there was a cemetery, I forget where it was, but there was a few gravestones that had swastikas on them. And not meaning they were, not that someone had graffitied them, that people wanted the swastika. And again, how do we look at that? How do we look, if there was a statue of Hitler in New York City, I have a feeling the Jewish community would be up in arms. What about a statue of Henry Ford, who was an anti-Semite, but does he stand for that? So I think these are a few different issues that are all conflating together. But I think it's important for us sometimes to think about, okay, if this was us, if the world...
Absolutely right. But at the same time, not everyone who says, I was gypped yesterday, or I took a gypsy cab, thinks that he's saying something about the Roma people. The person may not even know that the origin of that word goes back to a stereotype. And that's what makes it complicated. Maybe we should change those words. On the other hand, there are many words that have very strange origins. Are we going to change them all? The word hysterical goes back to an idea that it all is based in the womb, and it was once a slight on women. Same word as hysterectomy. Today there are hysterical men. I know some of them, and nobody uses the word. Who uses the word thinks of its origin. So it's complicated, and I think discernment matters. I think you also have to ask, what are the motivations of the person using the word, and to what extent are the folks truly offended by it? If the Roma people really were to argue that those words should be expunged from the language, perhaps we would be more sensitive in our use of those kinds of terms.
Right. Okay, we have one last question, and then we're sort of running out of time. This has been fascinating. Thank you so much. This is I've learned a tremendous amount, and this is just thinking about these issues, but doing it, not sort of on the cuff, but in a historical perspective is fascinating. So thank you. One question is, again, I think it's interesting, in society today, and maybe it's a reflection on the African-American community and other communities, that this is really a time, where their voice is being, we've had the civil rights movement, and there's other times as well, but there's certain times, and I don't know if it's the historical ups and downs, that a time calls for a certain type of movement. I was interested, as far as anti-Semitism in this country, and as far as symbols of anti-Semitic symbols, does this remind you of any time, or is there any other similar time in Jewish American history where, there was an outcry, or maybe it was from the Jewish community in a certain similar sense? Was any that crying out against anti-Semitic symbols? Is this anything that resonates with you?
In America, the anti-Semitism that Jews have decried has more been based on individuals. You mentioned Henry Ford. And remember, Henry Ford was one of the leading figures of his day. He was a hero. Some people thought he should be president. And yet he believed that the Jews were the world's foremost problem. He published books which he widely distributed called The International Jew. And the truth of the matter is that his anti-Semitism lives on, alas, on the web. It never disappeared. But the sense was that Ford should apologize, that there were Jews who boycotted Ford. And I have to say, Henry Ford II spent much of his life trying to undo the damage that his father did, meaning the Henry Ford II had many Jewish friends, but it wasn't about symbols. I do think that Jews fought very hard against discrimination, which was once prevalent in this country, and wanted to be treated as equals, and made clear that the glass ceilings that at one time prevented Jews from being bankers or from living in certain areas or vacationing in certain places, that all of that was unacceptable, and Jews fought very hard, often with blacks, to change the law so that that kind of discrimination would be illegal. And it seems to me that that was the way Jews preferred to deal with it. But it is the case that Jews fought to have Jewish symbols accepted, let's say in the military, so that Jews who wanted to wear a Star of David could do so that a Jewish chaplain could wear a Jewish symbol rather than a non-Jewish one. In each case, the community makes a decision what's worth fighting for. But I do think that the Jewish fight against anti-Semitism, as you suggest, makes us sensitive when we see other groups, especially African Americans, fighting for their rights.
Right. Amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Sarna. This was fascinating. And thank you so much, Rabbi Jacobs, for joining. I'm just going to share a final thought as we sign off. I mean, this what a fascinating discussion, and really balancing these different ideas of standing up for what we believe in, fighting for what we believe in, even be willing, as we said in the beginning of the forefounder of the Jewish people, Abraham, destroying things for what he believes in. But on the other hand, realizing that different people have different ways of looking at symbols, of looking at different things in different ways, and how do we balance our passion and our sense of justice with also understanding that maybe other people see things differently. But I was thinking about the idea, and Professor Sarna just mentioned the idea that, if maybe in Jewish American history, less than fighting to take away symbols, it was sometimes a fight for symbols. And there's no doubt that in Judaism, there are symbols that resonate with us, that stand with us to mean something bigger than who we are ourselves, things that represent who the Jewish people are. One of the fascinating, I wouldn't call it a symbol because it actually had a very functional purpose, but we're in a time right now building up to a couple of weeks, the Jewish holiday of Tisha B'Av, which is the 9th of Av, where the temples in Jerusalem were destroyed. And like I said, the temples in Jerusalem had a functional purpose, but they also symbolize something much bigger. They symbolize the idea of really bringing holiness into this world, of having unity, where not only every Jew, but every person around the world could come to the temple in Jerusalem, see open miracles, connect to holiness, give of themselves to something much bigger than themselves. It was a literally a symbol of unity, a symbol of spirituality, a symbol of holiness. But another thought that I had during this discussion is while it's true that we Jews do have symbols, but like we said before, we're a little adverse to statues, we're a little adverse to physical representations of some of our beliefs. And I think the reason might be, is, I was thinking about the holiday of Passover. The holiday of Passover, we have the Seder. We talk about how we were slaves in Egypt. And one of the most powerful things we say is that we have to see ourselves as if we were slaves in Egypt. And we have a responsibility to teach on to our children and the next generation this idea of who we as Jews, seeing ourselves in this place. And it's sort of, I don't know, the thought entered my head that as opposed to creating statues and having museums and, we're going to teach our children about our history and who we are as Jews by going and seeing some physical object. Instead, as Jews, we choose to act as Jews, to teach our children and teach ourselves, not by going and looking at something physical, but by living it, by living and breathing Judaism, by living it day to day, by seeing ourselves as we were our ancestors and what they went through, but also today making Judaism real and alive, right? There is the idea that Adolf Hitler wanted to create a museum for the Jews. After he annihilated us, it was going to be a nice museum that you could learn about the Jews. But no, we don't see ourselves as a museum, as a place of statues. We see Judaism as living and breathing. And maybe that's one of the lessons we can take out of this as well. So thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you, Professor Sarna, for being our guest tonight. Please join us next week as we will continue Thursday Night Live. Next Thursday night, 8 p.m. Eastern. We're going to have another fascinating program. Please check us out on Facebook. Check out HTV for classes all week long. And we really thank you for coming tonight. Have a great night.